Great to have your company tonight. Welcome to the program. Chris Lynched with you. Well, what is going on in Christchurch when it comes to SERA? We know that SERA is now, well, pretending to disappear, don't we? And we've got this regeneration authority. Is it really any different? To discuss that and a lot of issues facing Christchurch at the moment, I'm joined by ACT leader David Seymour. David, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Good to have you on the program. Let's start with SERA. What on earth do you think's going on? This so-called SERA, we're getting rid of SERA. We're going to have this regeneration authority. I was speaking to the Minister on Friday on News Talk CB, but the same staff. Really, this is the same thing. What are your thoughts?
I don't know what you people in Christchurch have done. I thought you'd suffered enough and now you get another government acronym. Look, you know, if you ever wanted a real demonstration of how the government fails on the one hand and free enterprise succeeds on the other, you've just got to walk along Victoria Street. You know, I mean, you walk along Victoria Street and it looks like a Scandinavian capital like Copenhagen or Oslo or somewhere. You've got these big modern architecture, big glass facades. A little bit of a problem if you're working late, people tend to look in.
We know about that, don't we?
Yeah, but aside from that, that's free enterprise, that's people with property rights getting on rebuilding. And in the centre of the donut that Christchurch has become, you've got the government. And 4 or 5 years later, they still can't figure out what they're doing. No. And the idea seems to be that a new title will fix it. What they should have done is said, here's your compensation, here's your property rights, here's your basic infrastructure, go
start building. Yeah. Correct. You're so right about private enterprise, and what a truer word spoken, the fact that you look in the central city, yeah, okay, we've got bits and pieces, there's Ballantyne's, there's the bus exchange, but it's a dump. It's embarrassing, and also down Durham Street as well. So I want to pick you up on that. I mean, the government has been a failure when it comes to trying to get things back in order, and I point to the delays. Let's start with that, shall we? What do you got? The convention centre, the sports metro facility, the Avon River precinct, the Breeze project, the urban development inside, the 4 avenues. It's all on the delay. Yeah. What is going on? Do you think?
Well, I just asked the question generally. If you were a hotshot property developer, you knew what the people wanted, you knew how to assemble the capital to produce it, and you had the plans and the connections to pull it all together, would you be rebuilding Christchurch, making a packet and giving people what they want, making this a wonderful city again, or B, working for SERA? And I think basically, anyone who's working for SERA fully respect the challenges that they faced, and they did face significant challenges, but the private enterprise around the fringe of the city has shown that they weren't up to it. And I would say, look, why don't we, as quickly as possible, return to property rights, basic infrastructure provided by government, and let people get on with rebuilding their city.
So in a way, you're suggesting the government should get the hell out of the central city?
I think that there is still a role for government. The role of government is to do things like basic infrastructure, sewers, roads, water reticulation. Those are things that you can't really have a private market in. So I'm not an anarchist, I think government should do some stuff. Yeah. But when you look at all of these different precincts and this type of industry is going to be here and that type of industry is going to be there, if you look at any city in the world the way it is today, who could have told you 20 years ago that's what it would be like? Lots of people will tell you in hindsight they knew, but the reality is cities are very complex, they're organic, they involve hundreds of thousands of people going about their business, and the central planners don't have a hope.
Do you think then the city should have been allowed to have grown organically as opposed to this roped off kind of thing where, as you've seen in Christchurch, there's not much going on apart from the private development?
Yeah, I do.
It's embarrassing.
I do. I actually think that this government generally has a problem that it doesn't get the basic regulatory environment right, and then it tries to do a whole lot more stuff on top to make up for it. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In Auckland they have Sky City Convention Centre. They can't decide how many pokie machines should be allowed, and then they decide to fiddle around with those regulations to try and get a convention centre built. Then they find out that actually for the regulatory allowances they made, Sky City aren't prepared to pay the full price and build a full-size convention centre. What will now be built will be competing with the Aotea Centre. So instead of enhancing the market, they've screwed it up and they gave away their regulations. Or here's another one. What is New Zealand's position on exporting live sheep? well, one year it's this, another year it's that, then you've got to go and send 900 pregnant sheep to some guy in Saudi Arabia. And instead of actually getting the regulatory environment right and deciding what our position is, we've now got this total disaster. And I could go on, but Christchurch is another example. Instead of getting the basic environment right for people to build their own property, the government's got too involved, and as a result, nothing's happened.
It was a nice to have when the government announced the 100-day blueprint for the city. We're going to have the convention centre and this and that and the animations. It looked brilliant. It looked like something from Disneyland. It was well to do at a time when the city needed hope. The reality is, though, we've got a government now that appears to be backtracking on some of its major developments, like the convention centre. And I put it to the Prime Minister and Mr Brownlee a couple of weeks ago, why not just reduce the size of this monstrosity and get on with it? Do you believe Christchurch, in a population of, what, 350,000, actually even needs a convention centre?
Well, if I knew the answer to that question, I wouldn't be sitting here doing this job. I'd be investing or not investing in the property that Christchurch people want. And I don't know the answer to those questions. What I do know is that it's a politician's job to get the regulations right, to give people rapid consents, strong property rights, decent infrastructure, let them get on with it. There's lots of business people out there who can answer the question about whether or not we need a convention centre. As soon as you ask politicians to do it, first of all, they're not the right people, generally. Second of all, they're doing it with your money instead of their own, and they take silly risks.
Where to from now? I mean, you're in Christchurch, you've had a sense to see what you've seen. You've touched on Victoria Street. Give us your overall, perhaps in a sentence, impression of what you see in a city that's experienced a catastrophic natural disaster.
Heroic people, terrible management, and it could be a lot better if the government tried to do a few things well instead of trying to do everything. When
you say terrible management, from the part of the government or the council?
I don't know a lot about the council down here, but everything I hear is that Lan Dalzell's actually been doing quite a good job, and even though she's sort of from the other side, she's one of the more respectable people on the other side of politics. So,
I think she's been trying to keep the peace.
Yep, and hey, she's going to privatise some stuff, and I wish we could do that in Auckland actually. The council owning commercial activities, never a good idea. Once again, if you knew how to run a commercial enterprise, would you be A, running it, making a packet and improving people's lives, or B, sitting on the council?
We're going to take a break. When we return, the housing crisis facing not just Auckland but here in Christchurch, with house prices flattening out, will things actually start to improve in the marketplace? That's next. Welcome back to Lynched. My guest tonight is ACT Party leader David Seymour. David, in terms of the housing crisis, are things tailing off in your mind when we've looked, well, probably not in Auckland so much, but Christchurch, the prices are coming down. Do you think they will continue to come down? Is the bubble going to burst? We've got some commentators saying, look, the Auckland house prices and Christchurch house prices, they cannot continue to sustain the exorbitant amounts people are asking for.
Yeah, well, let's just start with one basic fact, is that most places in the world, they manage to produce housing for about 3 years' income. So, you know, if you're earning 100k, you probably can buy a house that you'd kind of like for 300k and 50k, 150, whatever. Now, the reality is in New Zealand that for the last 20 years we've got further and further away from that. So the ratio between a household's income and the price of a house is getting close to 9 in Auckland. It's 5 or 6 at the moment in Christchurch. So we have a market that's way out of whack. I don't care what anyone says. It's not about interest rates. It's not about kids drinking too many lattes. The fact is that the ratio between people's incomes and house prices is very, very high. Is there a bubble? Will it burst? Not sure, but what I do know is that when your houses are twice as expensive as they've been historically compared to people's incomes, people are more vulnerable at servicing their mortgages, and any downturn is going to have a deeper crash. They found this in the great financial crisis in the US. The places that had high ratios of house prices to income had big hard landings. The places that had well-functioning housing markets didn't really notice that much.
So what's a well-functioning market then?
Well, a well-functioning market is one that just keeps providing housing as people demand it. So, the situation we've got in Auckland, which is giving huge trouble to the rest of the country, is that basically there's about 25,000 houses shortage each year. So for the number of people coming into the city, there should be another 25,000 houses each year. And as a result, people just crowd into garages and back rooms and so on, multiple families in a house, whatever. But the other thing they do is that they desperately bid up the price. Now, you just have to ask yourself, in the last 30 years, have we forgotten how to build roads? Have we forgotten how to survey sections? Have we forgotten how to build houses? Why has it suddenly become so much more expensive to build new homes? And the answer, frankly, is that councils have gotten too big for their boots. They now believe it's their role to design cities like the old East Germans and Soviets
restrict
used to
land
do.
supply.
Yeah, and they have a vision that basically it's a moral crusade for them. If you are a good person, then you live in an apartment over a train station and catch the train to work, hoping that you also work near a train station.
That's right.
And
live in a box apartment.
Yep, and if you're a bad person, then you have kids and drive all over town taking them to rugby practice and picking up groceries and parking in your driveway and all that sort of thing.
How do you live in the fringes of Christchurch? But you raise an interesting point, and that's a fundamental left and right debate at the moment, I believe, particularly in Christchurch, is that you do have a council that essentially does restrict land supply. So of course it's going to go up in the middle because apparently we're all supposed to live in tiny boxes.
And for good, for good
real.
reason. Every time I come to Christchurch, you're coming down in the plane and you just see this massive shortage of land you guys have got. I mean, you got to get onto this because pretty soon Christchurch will be all the way out to the Alps. There'll be no land left for anything else.
But here's the thing, though. So obviously, from your point of view, or the ACT Party's point of view, you're into releasing more land. When you say releasing more land, just around the fringe suburbs of Christchurch, or what though? Because at the moment we've got an issue with the Waimak and so on. They're going gangbusters, but they're not within the Christchurch dimension.
Well, that's actually one of the sort of unintended consequences. So you get your major city, in this case Christchurch, has this ideological position that you've got to save all that land out there. But then you've got your sort of satellite cities like Selwyn and Waimak, or satellite councils, who have a different attitude. And so you get this leapfrog development. So there's a sort of Christchurch, then there's a gap, then there's some other council building. And so the whole policy was to prevent the city spreading out. It's made it spread even further. And they'd be far better to just work on the basis that if you own property, you're allowed to develop it and sell it.
I want to come back to this perhaps economic bubble that could burst, and not just with housing but also with falling dairy prices. Finance Minister Bill English says falling dairy prices are not as disastrous for the economy as we seem to think they are. We're not heading for a recession, but there are some economists who are predicting perhaps even a partial recession if dairy prices continue to fall, our weak dollar and the housing prices. What do you make of that? Do you think there's some truth in that? Of course, Bill English is never going to admit it, but you've got some pretty sensible economists coming out recently from a range of different banks saying it's not looking flash. What do you say?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. You're right. If you're the Minister of Finance, you have to say it's going to be okay. How many countries do you know where the Minister of Finance says, actually, guys, you're stuffed? So there's no surprise he says that. Is he right? Well, when you think about it this way, dairy is 5 or 6% of the economy, and it's 20% of exports, and you're potentially going to lose 20% of that because of dairy prices going down so far. And then you say, all right, where does that put you? Well, that knocks 1% off GDP. And if growth is currently 2 or 3%, then you're not going to have a recession. You're still going to be growing at 1 or 2% nationwide. But the other factor you've got to consider is that, as we saw in the Great Financial Crisis, banking systems are interlinked. So the same banks that are lending to Auckland property buyers have also lent to all of these marginal dairy producers who have gone more and more intensive as the prices were rising and are now quite exposed. So I don't know what the bank's balance sheets look like, but they're pretty scared after the Auckland property market. The Reserve Bank Governor's trying to reel them in. Could it lead to some sort of contagion? I hope not. From
a government point of view, when do you think, though, I mean, if prices continue to fall, as always happens, the farmers put their hands out and plead poverty and say, give us more cash. Should there be a time where we just stop and say no? Or do you think if they continue with their intensive farming, then we just have to continue to give them a helping hand, considering supposedly some would suggest our economy is largely dairy?
Well, I mean, we've been here before as a country. I was growing up as a kid in the 80s, and they used to say, we've got to support farming because it's the backbone of the economy. And then you say, hang on, how can you possibly be holding up the backbone? If we've got to subsidise the backbone, what's holding everything else up? You cannot subsidise the biggest industry or one of the biggest industries. And if you do start subsidising it, you don't make things any better. You just make sure that you preserve inefficient operators. So no, we should never subsidise our biggest industry. We should never subsidise any industry, because when you subsidise them, you just make sure that inefficient operations continue, and then they have to be killed off some other way later on, as they were in the 1980s. It was painful, and we don't want that again.
We've got to take a break. When we return, you were strongly opposed to the cyber bullying bill. You and about 4 other Green members want to discuss that as well, and how relevant the ACT Party is in this neck of the woods. Stay with us. Welcome back to Lynched. David Seymour is my guest tonight. David, you were strongly opposed to the cyber bullying bill, you and a couple of Green members. I was surprised by that. Why?
Shouldn't be.
What's so wrong with that? Because you said essentially it takes away freedom of speech and it makes everybody be nicer on the internet. What is wrong with actually being nicer?
Well, there's nothing wrong with being nicer, but there is something wrong with the government passing laws to try and make people be nicer, because the only way it can work is if somebody out there has a big stick and the power to make you be nice. Now, do you think that there should be a person out there who decides whether you're being nice and whacks you if they think you're not?
But it's not a person that decides, though. It's your individual emotions, I suppose, because now we have a bill that says if you are offended by something, if it's really nasty, then you can go to somewhere and some authority and ask them to take it down. They get given a 24-hour notice period. I guess what it'll come down to, though, is where that threshold is, what we deem to be offensive or not. In your view, then, what is offensive on the internet and what's not? And what is fundamentally wrong with this bill?
Well, I get quite a lot of abuse on the internet.
Really?
Keep it coming, folks. And
Twitter's the worst, isn't it?
Well, it is.
The echo chamber of the board.
Yeah, it's not exactly Mensa. But anyway, that's the stuff that goes on online. And if I had a magic wand that would make everybody be nice to each other, of course I would use it. But the fact is that what's one person's freedom of speech is another one's grave offence, and that's just life. That's how it works out there. And you say, well, what about the children? Well, this is supposed to protect the children by having a bunch of adults at an approved agency going in 48 hours after the fact, trying to mitigate kids' arguments on the internet. Now, I like the intention, but it's hopeless. So on the one hand, you've got adults who are being told whether or not they're being nice by other adults, and then you've got kids being mean to each other with an old, archaic government mechanism that doesn't even keep up with what they're doing online. It's going to help nobody, but it will erode freedom of speech.
But don't we need something in place to ensure that cyberbullying, where there's a threshold where you say enough is enough? Don't you think we need something? When you look at some of the suicides and Facebook
I tried to change the bill. I said, there's a stage, the committee stage, where MPs can put in their amendments, and I put in one that basically said, look, I think there's a gap in the law where you can take revenge porn, and you take an intimate recording of someone, then you go and put it online without their knowledge, basically to get back at them. That's not a crime at the moment. I think that should be a crime. But we could have just made a law that said doing that's a crime, okay? Arguably, incitement to suicide could be made a crime.
Well, it is now, isn't it?
It is now.
Telling somebody to go kill themselves online is effectively a crime.
But we didn't have to do all of the other stuff that the bill does. I mean, people should actually read the 10 communications principles and it looks like a good behaviour contract for a school camp. It's not appropriate for a society of 4.5 million adults.
I understand though the bill or this new legislation will be reviewed in a year. Does it give you some heart that you'll be able to look at it and decide then whether it was working or not?
Well, I'd rather just not make bad rules in the first place, but yeah, that is a mitigation. The other thing you got to say about this is that it's such a case study in bad lawmaking. So you had a terrible event, Roastbusters, but these were guys who were getting underage girls drunk and having sex with them. You know, that's already a crime. So let's enforce that rule rather than having a new agency, this approved agency as they call it, and a whole new set of rules and offences. I'm not confident we're going to be any better at enforcing those, but you're going to have more civil servants imposing more rules on otherwise free people, and I think that's a step backwards.
You think this will just become too confusing because we still don't really know. As you say, somebody may be offended by something, the other person may see that as free speech, and we've got only a select handful of people that will be able to decide what is offensive. However, the law does state it comes down to if you as an individual are offended. So there's room for such interpretation. It's very subjective.
Yeah, and look, I mean, you know, we've been here before in our society where you say the law's very vague and some civil servant gets to decide. And there's this moralising tone where they say, well, you know, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, and if you're being reasonable, we won't use these laws against you. Well, that's very nice, but I actually want laws that protect my rights and freedoms rather than depending on civil servants to be nice to me.
A few moments left, the ACT Party. Let's discuss what's going on in Christchurch. The election, not a hell of a lot of votes to be fair. The by-election about 56 on the east. Not exactly a rousing display of support for the ACT Party. What's gone wrong, or do you see the ACT Party as being more Epsom and that's it? Do you want to extend your voting base? How are you going to do it?
I want to do well in our second biggest city. That's why I'm down here today. You know, it'd be easy to stay at Epsom, but I come down here almost monthly at the moment because I want to build support in Christchurch. I think that Christchurch is fundamentally an enterprising place. It's a place with a lot of engineering. I happen to be an engineer myself. And so I want to rebuild our support here. I accept we've done very badly in the past. Frankly, it's because people have been hearing more about ACT and its shenanigans rather than from ACT and what we want to do for the voter.
That's a fair point. There was, you're right about that. Too much political drama last time before you were in. Is that gone now, do you think? A clean sweep?
Well, look,
Don's gone, Rodney's gone.
Yeah, if you look at the way that we're reported, I don't think we've ever had so much positive reporting about what we're doing and what we're offering the voters, rather than all this shenanigan that went on in the past. My intention is to keep it that way.
Well, let me ask you this question just finally, perhaps, before we've got to go. But then what are the give me the one fundamental difference at the moment, if you can, between National's policies and ACT policies? Because that's the difficulty you have, isn't it? At the moment you're seeing more as John Key's friend than anything else. So is that going to, do you need to differentiate yourself more then?
Well, your friends can give you a nudge from time to time. For example, John Key thinks that pensions and superannuation are something that he can just leave for the next Prime Minister to worry about. I think that's irresponsible. I've proposed that we have a referendum about superannuation age. Now, people may have a range of views about that, and it's fine, but I'd much rather live in a country that is approaching long-term challenges like superannuation than having a referendum on changing the flag. That's the difference.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
RMA reform, you know, fundamentally, if we don't reform the RMA, we're going to have basically a generation of tenants. And ACT is the only party that is pushing hard on that. The Nats on a good day say they want to do something, then they don't. So again, we're the only ones pushing hard. Corporate welfare, much as we've seen in Christchurch, you've got a government that thinks it can move people around like pieces on a chessboard. Our view is get the regulation right, get the tax right, let people get on with it.
We're out of time. You can invoice me for the party political broadcast later. David Seaman, nice to meet you. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
And that is our programme. Don't forget to join me on News Talk CB tomorrow. Christchurch, Mealy and Dalzell fronts up for the weekly chat. But from all of us here at CTV, have a good night.